Set me as a seal upon thine heart, as a seal upon thine arm, for love is strong as death, jealousy is cruel as the grave. The coals thereof are coals of fire, which hath a most vehement flame. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it. If a man would give all the substance of his house for love, it would utterly be contemned. The expense of spirit in a waste of shame is lust in action, and till action, lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, extreme, rude, cruel, not to trust, enjoyed no sooner but despised straight, past reason hunted, and no sooner had past reason hated, as a swallowed bait, on purpose laid to make the taker mad, mad in pursuit and in possession, so had having and in quest to have extreme, a bliss in proof and proved a very woe, before a joy proposed, behind a dream. All this the world well knows, yet none knows well to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell. Love is a hawk with velvet claws. Love is a rock with heart and veins. Love is a lion with satin jaws. Love is a storm with silken reins. Hello, and welcome to session 2 of Playing God, searching for a sentient form of artificial intelligence, where we are exploring this development of artificial intelligence and trying to look at some of this through a theological and humanities-based perspective. Starting off today, we began with 3 different quotes, one from the Song of Solomon, book of Song of Solomon in the Old Testament, which really captures the spirit of what we were ending session 1 looking at. And that's this struggle within the soul, the human soul, between the passions and maybe logic and reason and such, and the danger of when the passions win over the soul and take what may otherwise be healthy, normal behavior tied to this world and turn it into something that's consuming and even damaging to one's soul and psyche. And the way in which that excerpt from the Song of Solomon describes that tension, like fire and coals igniting, where love starts to drift more toward the passionate form of lust and such, really is beautifully represented there. And then that same theme was captured in the second excerpt, which was actually an entire sonnet by William Shakespeare, Sonnet 129. And there he too is looking at the power of lust and the passions that are tied to it. And the final quote might have been one that escaped many of you. The first 2, are fairly knowable and such, but the third one actually comes from a 1950 short story titled Ipecac, which was written by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. And that particular excerpt defines love in a poetic way, but it is a poem that was created by this artificial intelligence in the short story, which was a computer known as Ipecac, which I cannot help but think was somehow bringing to mind the syrup of Ipecac, which of course would make you violently ill when you would drink it. Used many times as a way to get something that you don't want in your system out of your system. And here we have this, as Kurt Vonnegut describes, this well over $700 billion computer that takes up this huge amount of space, that was supposed to be the most advanced thinking computer of the day. And of course, this is science fiction written in 1950. But what he taps into, I think, is a very important theme about artificial intelligence, because the person who's working with the computer on a daily basis has fallen in love with another individual who's working in the office. Her name is Pat. And he's way too logic thinking. He's way too much driven by reason. He's not able to tap into any kind of romantic side. And so on a whim, he programs Ipecac to write for him a poem to try to win her over. And the poem really does a nice job in regard to getting Pat to show this guy some attention. And of course, he represents the poetry as his own. He then continues in this dialogue with Ipecac, explaining what love is, explaining why he wants this poem created and why he needs another, and so forth. And in the end, it's the poem that I quoted that describes love that wins Pat's heart, and she agrees to marry him. And then, of course, in a conversation with the computer, the protagonist here, who's trying to win Pat over, realizes that the computer has fallen in love with Pat. And when he explains to the computer that that simply can't be, the computer ends up short-circuiting itself and basically killing itself, and in the end leaves him a wonderfully heartfelt note about wanting to be human, wanting to be able to love Pat and have Pat love it. And as a final gesture of good faith, though, the computer leaves him 500 years worth of poems that he can continually pull from and honor Pat with. So it's a very touching short story, but it captures sort of the spirit that we were ending session 1 with about the computer and its ability to take artificial intelligence to a level that replicates in some way a level of consciousness, this concept of the soul that is so beautifully described in the Song of Solomon and then in Sonnet 129, that so often is a part, again, of the soul that brings about a human ability to create art and to take a level of creation that is much further along than any level of artificial intelligence today. So, one thing that we could look at, though, is, how can a human interact with artificial intelligence to create, in this case, poetry? How close have we gotten to Ipecac, and whether or not artificial intelligence, could create poetry at that level? And of course, as you know, we haven't, but there is an interesting project that Google has been developing, experimenting with artificial intelligence, and it allows you, the user, to actually begin to compose poetry with a host of historical poets and allow them to work with you through artificial intelligence to actually create a poem. So let's look at that and see what that level of poetry can begin to create, what it can look like. The torment of the heart. Love is a storm that reaches highs and lows, tempting or dreaming in this night of woe. By Scott Crawford, with the help of Edgar Allan Poe. No, by no means was that anywhere near the level of poetry that we began this session with. However, what's more exciting about that is in the way that this poem was created. Basically, by using Google's verse-by-verse application, I was able to choose one of numerous poets to work with me in order to create a poem. The user enters the first line. The user can determine how long the poem's going to be, how many syllables per line, the rhyme scheme, all of the basic structure of the poem, and then the user enters that first line. Then the AI analyzes the poetry of the poets that the user has chosen with whom to work on this poem, and is able to take similar lines that would fit what the user has put in as the first line. The user can either then continue to create the poem on his or her own, or the user can then grab a line from one of the poets they have chosen with whom to work on the poem. And over time, the poem comes into shape. And so, again, it's not by any means a great poem, but it's more in the way that the poem's created that's kind of cool. that you can work with these poets from the past, and in some way, shape, or form, the AI is able to, this algorithm is able to analyze poems by those poets and create what the AI thinks the poet would have written in relation to both the rules that the user has put forth in regard to how the poem's to be structured, and then the lines that the poet, the user, has actually created. So to further demonstrate how this works, rather than working with Edgar Allan Poe, I chose to work with Phyllis Wheatley and see how she would react to my opening line for the couplet that I was trying to write. So choosing Phyllis Wheatley now, using the same rules as what I used before with Poe, and even using the same opening line, "Love is a storm that reaches highs and lows," I entered this stanza and found the AI analyzing Phyllis Wheatley and then providing some possible lines that I could use as the final line for the couplet. In looking them over, the one that jumped out to me and kind of touched me at some level was, "And leaves that soul in endless numbers glow." And so taking that line and inserting it, now collaborating with Phyllis Wheatley, or at least AI's understanding of Phyllis Wheatley, we now have a very different poem, one that now reads, "Love is a storm that reaches highs and lows and leaves that soul in endless numbers glow." As one might expect, that's a little more optimistic than what Poe would provide, and so that resulted in me slightly changing the title of the poem to "The Light of Love." I hope everyone who just looked at that experiment with poetry appreciated more the way in which Google is using artificial intelligence to allow users to, in some way, shape, or form, become exposed to the writing styles of a host of various poets throughout history, as opposed to, in any way, shape, or form, looking at my ability to write poetry, of which there is very little to none. I recognize the poetry itself was nothing significant, but it was more intended to demonstrate two things. First of all, what an interesting way to use AI. Imagine the ways in which students can possibly get exposed to different poets in a very intimate way, in a way that they can choose a theme or a topic, contribute some poetic thoughts on that topic, and then actually, in some way, shape, or form, virtually collaborate with poets who have long since left us. All because an algorithm is able to scour, presumably the internet, to be able to quickly read various poems by that particular poet, pick up on certain patterns and trends within that writing, and create, all within seconds, be able to create then a line of poetry that in a way relates to what the user is trying to convey. And then allowing the user to either use those suggestions or continue on and modify those suggestions in a certain way that's more personable and so forth. But if you really think about that as an educational experience, it's pretty cool. But here's another important point about this, and this is really what I want to drive home. And maybe there's really 2 points kind of hidden in here, collected, together. And that is, as we've been saying, AI is not at a level in which it can have the kind of passion and conflict within a soul as we heard in the Song of Solomon, from the book of Song of Solomon at the beginning of this session. Can't fully grasp or understand the topic of lust as Shakespeare explores it, and is in nowhere near the level where Kurt Vonnegut dreams about AI being way back in 1950 with the AI entity Epichat. So while the computer can't do it itself, it just simply can't. The algorithm isn't that advanced to be able to understand truly those struggles and experience those feelings, etc., that drive creativity at any significant level. What occurred in that entire example was that we saw a relationship that I tried to model for you between a human, me, and AI. In this case, the algorithm related to analyzing the poetry of a host of different poets, so that through this collaboration, through human and machine interaction, some degree of creativity could take shape and could unfold. And at this point in time, that's where we are with AI. AI is a tool. It's something that humans can use in a way that they can do whatever they're trying to do in a way that is better, more efficient, possibly quicker. When you think back to session one and the project that I explained and described related to our work at Virginia 811 with Virginia Tech, and the use of an algorithm, the use of AI to audit 100% of our web ticket entry tickets that come to us through the internet, that thousands of tickets coming in through this channel are able to be screened by an algorithm in a matter of minutes, something that no human could possibly do. We would have to hire so many individuals to be able to begin to accomplish that. It would be simply cost prohibitive. But now an algorithm can do just that. Within minutes, the algorithm can at one level look at every single excavation locate request that's coming in through the internet. And then through its analysis, if a particular request exceeds a certain threshold, then that ticket, that request, is sent to a human who can then better audit the ticket, the request, to determine whether or not there is indeed an issue that needs to be addressed. In essence, what's unfolding within this model is the machine does what it does best, a simple, straightforward analysis of every ticket in the matter of minutes, and humans then do what they do best, deeper analysis that captures some of the nuances and the issues of interpretation that the algorithm simply cannot grasp or handle at this time, and then, more importantly, allow a human to reach out to the person who submitted the request in order to provide human interaction to better understand the request and possibly take corrective action. That level of service generally is better performed by a human. So this whole experiment we just did with this wonderful tool related to poetry highlights a very important theme about AI, and that is that where we are with AI currently, it typically involves AI and humans working together in order to accomplish certain feats, certain goals, and so forth. This leads us down another rabbit hole for a minute, and that takes us back to the 1980s. Back in the 1980s, when certain changes were starting to happen in music. Now keep in mind, the 80s were still part of the analog age. We had not gone digital yet. This was the age of these boxes that some of you won't believe. These boxes that used to be placed on a wall, and they had a cord that attached to a handheld device. And by either spinning numbers around or pressing numbers, one could make a telephone call. You were tethered to the wall, but you could actually communicate in a manner through analog with another person anywhere in the world. This is something that just, how many people have those in their homes now? Landlines are really just becoming a thing of the past, with the vast majority of houses increasingly no longer having landlines. We haven't had a landline in our house for at least 15, if not 16 years or so, entirely relying on smartphones, cell phones, in order to take care of the functions that a telephone once used. And let's be honest, how often is this thing even used to make an actual phone call. Most of the time it's text, it's some sort of instant messaging, social media, etc., which is a whole other topic for discussion. But back in the 80s, there was something that was going on in music that was pretty cool. You started to see the rise in the use of synthesizers. You started to see a new term being thrown about in music called MIDI, in which you would take various sounds and be able to, in a digital manner, start to mesh those sounds together and create a somewhat new soundscape, which started to embed itself more and more increasingly in the music of the day. And part of this emerging digital musical environment involved the drum machine. And of course, the drum machine would be a programmable piece of equipment in which a repetitive beat of some sort and percussion could be programmed to begin and play throughout a song. And my brother, who is a professional musician, and he's 11 years older than me, and I won't indicate his age, but let's just say I'm 52. But he's been able to make his entire career out of music. He finished with a bachelor's degree at Virginia Tech in psychology, of all things. He started an MBA program, and then he started to play for a singer named Jane Powell. And this was in the very early 80s. And Jane Powell is from Roanoke, and she became a wonderful musical force, traveling literally the globe, singing. Some of you may recognize that name. Well, my brother played drums for her through the 80s and up until 1992, and still to this day, he still manages her as she's still somewhat active in the music scene today. But I remember back at that time when my brother bought his first drum machine, and I remember my mother saying to him, "Why would you do that? That's going to replace you. Why would they need you to play drums if there's this machine that can basically play drums and percussion?" And it was a great response, and I still remember it to this day. I never understood how much it would resonate with me 30 years later, 35 years later, after hearing that and now being in business and dealing with AI and all of this. But what he said at the time was basically that's not going to happen. You still need an individual in the band playing the drums, reacting to musical changes that occur and unfold within the moment of performing. But what this will do, it'll allow a certain repetitive percussion element to be present within the music. That means it frees me up to focus on other areas that I can now do better. And that right there, folks, basically sums up the relationship we have with AI. AI in business, in many ways, it's our drum machine. It can allow us to do things in a way that's better than if humans had to devote energy and resources toward doing that. But it doesn't take away the human component. It allows for now a division of labor of some sort to develop, in which the AI can reinforce what humans are doing and help humans focus on what they need to be doing to do better. To quickly illustrate this, I have to take a moment to turn to one of the greatest bands of all time from the 80s, Morris Day and the Time. This band out of Minneapolis, associated with, of course, Prince and the whole Minneapolis music movement of the 1980s, which had a very unique sound that really highlighted synthesizers and such. Well, they had one song in particular that has a riff that runs through basically the entire song that is a drum machine. And it's this drum machine that's able to do something that would be very difficult for a human to maintain through the entire length of the song. And it's basically a repetitive riff with the percussion that is pretty intense. And so take a moment and just listen to that. So did you hear the drum machine? Basically, that was the predominant percussion sound that you heard through that entire section of the song. In fact, from my understanding, the recorded version of the song pretty much relied entirely on the drum machine. However, I have been fortunate enough to see the Time in concert just a few years ago when they came to Roanoke and they did 777-9311. And of course, they used the drum machine for that more complicated riff that would have been quite tiring to play throughout the entire song. But believe me, the drummer was still drumming. He was adding to the song, focusing on other percussion areas to enhance and make the song even better. Listening to that, you just cannot help but admit, of course, the 1980s was the best decade ever. And all I need to do is say, listen to a lot of the more contemporary music that's out there, and you hear a heavy 80s influence still today in the music. But again, that can also be a whole other discussion later. For the most part, though, what we're seeing is that within that song, we hear how a digital environment was beginning to emerge, and I would argue heavily that we in business today, when working with AI, there's a lot we can learn about how music operated and functioned during the 80s, as that industry was one of the first really to get into this digital age and experiment with it. And the biggest lesson, as I've indicated from that, is that AI really needs to be a tool that allows us to do what humans do better while letting AI do what it would be very difficult for humans to do consistently and over time and so forth. But now in the final theme for this session, it's going back again to what kind of keeps rearing its ugly head, and it's that struggle that humans have within their soul between the passions and logic and reason, and this constant struggle, as we discussed in session 1, in regard to man being created out of dust, but being given life through God's breath, and the idea that in some way this of course separates humans from other animals, in the sense that there is this concept of a soul within us where we are tied to this world, we are tied to the biological needs that are forced upon us to be able to continue to live, and yet this constant struggle not to allow the passions to consume us. And again, the book of Song of Solomon that started this whole session, looking at that fire that burns within us, and this suggestion of a conflict between what is healthy, being love, and then passion, which can devolve into lust. And then Shakespeare tackling that theme and so forth. It's hinted at even in the song you just heard, 777-9311. Here it is in the 80s, and a guy is trying to give a girl a phone number, and of course the suggestion is a future romantic rendezvous of some sort. He's in a very cool manner trying to get this message across to her. You know, are we flirting here with lust? Is there some new love emerging? Who knows? I'm sure it's probably the former rather than the latter, but nonetheless, this comes to another area of AI. Currently, AI is being used to help facilitate both love and lust. We have a host of dating sites that are now available, driven by algorithms, where individuals looking for love can enter information into this program, and the algorithm can then, in a very scientific manner, find the right match for those individuals. Now, this is the new way to meet people, apparently, for those that are single. And quite honestly, there's some evidence that could suggest it's successful. Roughly 30 to 40% of those in a committed relationship today indicate that they met the person that they're involved with through the internet, through an online service of some sort. Now, that may have been a dating service, or it may be through social media or something along those lines, but they met the person they're dating and even possibly married to through the internet. This is now, for the first time in history, meeting individuals through the internet now surpasses people that are dating, indicating that they have met their significant other, the person they're dating, whether it's marriage or just dating, in your typical ways, through church, the neighborhood, even at a bar and such. It's now online. This is where people are connecting. And there's a strong part of that that involves artificial intelligence. And while some of this is for good, there is true love that is being uncovered through the use of AI. One could argue that on the other side of the coin, there's also a lot that's going on that's not as positive and devolves back toward lust. There are AI algorithms being used to allow individuals to meet for those one-night stands, for just no real committed relationship. And of course, that even goes so far as to have algorithms helping people who are married find other individuals. So we find that struggle that humans have dealt with since going back to when humans first started creating societies and such. The Bible talks about this line that can be crossed between love, which is healthy and positive, and then lust, which of course is one of the 7 deadly sins. And that's sort of been the theme that's been running through this session as we look at the book of the Song of Solomon, and then also even Shakespeare and even Kurt Vonnegut Jr., and how he's looking at actually AI experimenting with love to the point that AI even takes its own life as it realizes it's not in a position in any way, shape, or form to be able to love the person that it has been composing poems for. So I guess the final thought out of all of this would be that AI is yet a new iteration of a constant struggle that humans have continually dealt with. It's now giving us a new environment in which to have these struggles in some ways. It can be a tool for good. It can be a tool to help us. But depending on how we use it, it can also be something that is not so positive. But it's not the AI that's making these decisions as to how it uses itself. It's up to humans who choose how to use the AI, how they program the AI. And that is just simply, again, the struggle that we have as humans in general. And so it all comes back again to the need for a strong theological foundation. I would say along with that, to support that, a focus on the humanities, not to be thinking that in some way AI is infallible because it's math, and therefore there is simply a binary right and wrong, and it's going to make the right decision for us. Nothing could be further from the truth in that, because humans are the ones creating that math, and humans are the ones that are still struggling with the passions and the struggles that we have within our soul, within this metaxy, the anxious middle we discussed toward the end of session 1. And therefore those struggles will somehow come through in the AI as we put our own biases within it. And so with that thought, that's going to set us up for next week's session, when we begin to explore exactly, how does bias come to play and come to bear on AI? And maybe to flip the coin around a little more, could there actually somehow be a soul in AI? We've been saying there's not, but could there be in some certain way an imprint on AI that we leave it that also gives it to some extent some very basic understanding of a soul? And that opens up a whole other door to follow and go through in order to explore some other themes and topics that we'll tackle next week. So again, thanks for hanging in there. I hope you've enjoyed this. We do have the email that's now up and running. I'm leaving a few links below that might send you to some more information that you might find interesting. Definitely the Google Poetry link will be there, and I would love it if some of you got in there and played with that. And go ahead and share with me through the email the poems. And that might be something that might be fun to discuss when we do have that final live Zoom conference tea time and coffee time as well. That will serve as the culminating final end for this particular series. Thanks you all so much, and please continue to stay safe.